I have 6 honourable mentions.
6.
Yep.
You made a top 16.
Yes.
He made a top 16. I have 2.
That's reasonable.
Yeah, I know.
You followed the rules.
I put a lot of thought into it. Welcome back to StoryToob. Depending on how things go, this could be our last or first video of the year.
What's the story? You all know what the story is. This is a top 10 video, a top 10 books of the year of 2024. This is the booktube staple. And for the naysayers of the top 10 and the rankings, cowards is what I say to those people. Cowards. Do a top 10. Rank them. Just do it. It's all for the crack. It doesn't really matter. Who cares? Get that, Philip? We love an L top 10 here on StoryToob. We love watching them. We love making them. Not too many. We don't make one every week. But the top 10 of the year is a booktube staple. And it's a staple of the entertainment factor here on booktube, which we very much enjoy because we want to get people reading and we want to get people reading broadly. And top 10s are a nice little way. Same with our wrap-ups. If you watch our last month we read videos, generally you'll see a sort of wide range of books. And we hope that this top 10 will be somewhat similar. And we also just like the nonsense that goes along with ranking stuff and saying, oh, well, was this better? I don't know, but I put this at number 4. It's not that serious. It's all just a bit of crack, as we say in Ireland. And I hope you enjoy.
As is usual on BookTube, there are a couple of ground rules. The first one is only one book per author goes in the top 10. That's just to make it a little more interesting for ourselves. Rule number 2 is no rereads qualify for the top 10. It's just difficult to compare something that you were already familiar with something brand new. But that's about it. Other than that, all things go. And the way this video is going to go is that we're going to take turns giving you our 10 to 6. Then we'll take turns again giving you our 5 to 2, and then at the very end we'll both reveal our top book of the year. So before watching the rest of the video, you could jump into the comments and let us know your predictions, since this is our first full year on BookTube. You have watched us read everything we've read this year. So give us your predictions. What do you think the top 3 is going to be? What do you think the top book is going to be? Is there anything that you think is going to be an upset? I'd love to know if we've been transparent and obvious in our choices.
I think I have, yeah. I also have a preface and a disclaimer for this top 10 list. I started reading A Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin in November of 2023. And then I parked it for a little while to read my book of the year of 2023, which was Lonesome Dove. And I finished it in January. And I said in our mid-year wrap-up that I would still include it. But honestly, my brain thinks of A Storm of Swords as a 2023 book, so it will not be included in this year's top 10.
Shall we start with some honourable mentions?
Yes, because I have loads.
You do know that's what the tubies were for.
Doesn't matter. I have 6 honourable mentions. I won't spend too long on them. First honourable mention I have is Criminal Deluxe Edition Volume 1 by Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips. I own now the Criminal comic book series in the 3 lovely deluxe hardcovers that collects all of the arcs in reading order, in publication order. And what Criminal is, it's a little series of vignettes about a city full of criminals and families and friends and acquaintances and people that have had dealings with this family called the Lawless family. And it looks at the effects of crime on this city and the families and everybody involved, and kind of generational trauma and passing stuff down, a legacy of violence. Great little series. I reread a good chunk of it, but a lot of the first volume was new to me. So that's an honourable mention. Another honourable mention for me, I have 2 non-fiction books in my honourable mentions. I have The End of Everything Astrophysically Speaking, which is a book about all the ways that the universe could potentially end in the study of eschatology within astrophysics. And this is written by Katie Mack, and this was a wonderful book full of humour and full of hope, actually, and how we should just appreciate living right now and look after the planet. Next honourable mention is The Invisible Doctrine, or The Secret History of Neoliberalism by George Monbiot and Peter Hutchison. This is all about the history of neoliberalism and kind of the rise of that ideology, specifically from like the 70s, 80s up to now, and how it dictates career choices and life decisions and all of this kind of stuff. Very interesting book, a nice little introduction to that idea, and it was a really, really interesting read, really well written, very punchy. Then I have Small Mercies by Dennis Lehane. Dennis Lehane has come out with a new book for the first time in almost a decade, I think, and I really enjoyed Small Mercies. It was actually my first book that I read in 2024, and it's going on the honourable mentions. And then my last two honourable mentions, I apologise, are two science fiction books. One is The Female Man by Joanna Russ, winner of the Hot Girl Tubi at the Tubies, and The Chrysalids by John Wyndham, which was another nominee in the science fiction category. I wanted to read a few more of the science fiction masterworks collection that I have. You might see it here behind us. And those were two books that I prioritized, and I loved both of them. They were great. But the top 10 this year is so stacked, because I had quite the year for reading, that they just didn't make it.
Well, I have two honourable mentions because this year I wanted to have the top 10 kind of stand for itself. And if you don't make the top 10, then you're not in the top 10, and that's it. The two honourable mentions that I have are two books that would have been top 10 candidates if I hadn't read other books by the same author. That's a slight tease there for you of what is to come for the top 10. So two honourable mentions are Small Mercies by Dennis Lehane, already mentioned, and Boy Parts by Eliza Clark, also winner of the Hot Girl Tubi.
Quickly, before we get into the top 10, we don't actually know each other's lists. We were finalizing them like 5 minutes before we started filming, so you'll also get our reactions to each other's lists.
My number 10, my 10th favourite read of 2024, let's kick it off, is Severed Echoes by Anya Dillon, winner of the Tubi Award for Science Fiction, winner of the Nutty Award for Best Surprise of 2024. It's been a great couple of days for Anya Dillon. Anya Dillon is our friend Amanda, who was featured here on the channel before from the channel Shelf Unstable. That did not influence my choice. I think she wrote a great book. And something that I really, really love about it is how it is kind of impossible to pin down what genre it is. This could be considered fantasy, it could be considered science fiction, it could be considered a thriller. There's elements of horror, there's elements of romance in there. It's kind of everything, and I don't think I've ever read a book like it. And for sheer creativity and originality in that way, it deserves a spot on this list. But also in a year where I struggled to really sink into books, especially in the second half of the year, this was a book that I read in 2 days, practically in 2 sittings. I could not stop reading. It was extremely well paced, very trim, engaging characters, and I never knew what was going to happen. There's one particular scene that is ingrained in my memory whenever I think about it. So what's this book about? Essentially it starts with a kidnapping. Our main character, her car breaks down and she gets kidnapped. And then we go from there. I don't really want to get too much into specifics of the plot because I think one of the joys of reading it is that you have no idea where it's going, and I don't want to take that away from you. So I'd say it starts with a kidnapping. We have some supernatural elements, we have twists and turns, we have the pacing of a thriller, and it's just such a fun book. I cannot wait for book 2. Oh yeah, this is the first in a duology. There you go. My number 9, and I do want to say, like, these are very, very close. My number 9 is a very recent read in the last month, in the last couple of weeks of 2024. I also reviewed it on the channel, and it's an author that is not new to me, but it's only the second book that I read by them, and it kind of cemented this author as one that I would kind of pick up anything by, and that is Beartown by Frederick Backman. So Beartown is the first book in a trilogy, but it does kind of stand on its own. I have not read the sequels yet, even though I would like to. And it's set in a small town in Sweden called Beartown, and it revolves around a junior ice hockey team and how important that is to the town. Rest assured, you do not have to care about hockey or know anything about hockey to enjoy this book. I certainly don't. But it's essentially about the small town community and what putting that amount of expectations and pressure does, for good or bad, for teenagers, and also how we put athletes on a pedestal. It's quite thematically rich in that way, and it just has great characters. I felt very immersed in the setting, and it was one of the books towards the end of the year that helped break me out of a bit of a reading slump. So that does help, just making me think about it fondly. It's also different enough from the other book that I've read by him, which is A Man Called Ove. It's tonally quite different. This is a lot more pondering and darker, but I still liked it just as much, I'd say. So that's why it just cements Frederick Backman as an author that I would always try, no matter what he's writing, because clearly the kind of stories that he tells appeal to me. My number 8. Okay, so my number 7 and my number 8 were kind of interchangeable, and I really struggled to put one above the other. But I'm happy with where I landed, because I chose to put the one that was a little bit more personal on the higher spot. So my number 8 is City in Ruins by Dawn Winslow. I would have been really disappointed if this book didn't make the list. It's the third book, the conclusion in the Danny Ryan trilogy, and it also concludes Dawn Winslow's writing career, at least for novels. He has retired from writing fiction to go into political activism, and this was his last novel, which came out this year. And I reread the first one, I read the second one of the trilogy, and then I read this one, and it was just a great experience. This is really just a showcase of everything that Dawn Winslow does best, everything that he likes to do, and you can tell that he's having so much fun, or that he had so much fun writing this trilogy. There's also absolutely no fat on it. It is very, very efficient, and I mean this in the best way. He is a master of his craft. You can tell that he's been honing those skills for decades, and he is capable of painting a picture of a situation, a character, a setting in as few words as humanly possible. And they're so well paced, these books. You can read each of them in like a couple of days, if even. And I loved them. And I also thought that this ending was great for this particular trilogy itself, not thinking about his like career as a whole. And it made me quite emotional. So I loved this book. It's the last novel that I'll ever read by Dawn Winslow as a new release. So that itself makes it more emotional as well. And I'm very happy that it made it onto this top 10. I did not say what this trilogy is about. It is a loose retelling, reimagining of the Trojan War, but with the mafia and crime families, and it's basically the Italian mob versus the Irish mob in Providence, Rhode Island, starting in, I think, in the 80s, and then we just go from there. And then it kind of gets, like, the first book is more that, and then we just get a bit looser. But yeah, that's the basic concept. That brings me to my number 7. And my number 7 is Happy Place by Emily Henry. I adored this book, and it's a bit of a case, and there's a couple now like that going higher in the list, of the right book at the right time. It's not my favorite Emily Henry romance. Like the main relationship here between Harriet and Wynne is great, but it's not one that make me swoon the way like Book Lovers did, or Beach Read, or one of those, or A Funny Story even.
Wyndham Connor is the main character's name.
It's a horrendous name.
It's a terrible name. Connor Wyndham would have made more sense. Sorry. Wyndham. What a stupid name. Go on.
However, it is my favorite in terms of everything that
Good book, though.
Is not the romance. And not that I don't like their relationship, but I mean, like, in terms of that, like, oh, you know, like, part of it, and the rom-com part of it. It's a great novel about life and being in your late 20s to mid 30s, I'd say. Like, you've been an adult for a few years, you've been working for maybe for a decade, you've been out of college for a good while, and maybe you're in a committed relationship and you've just gotten to a point where you're like, okay, I've been kind of drifting along and just doing things because they maybe felt right, but what's the plan? Where is this going? What am I doing? Oh my God, I'm not doing the right thing. I'm stuck in a thing that maybe I thought would be the right thing when I was 18. And now I realize that it's not. How can I possibly backtrack? And I think that is just an extremely relatable concept and something that was very relevant to our 2024, I'd say. And this book gave me anxiety, but it gave me anxiety because it was so relatable. And I thought that Emily Henry handled this extremely well. And I think it's important to have books, especially like romance books, that are like lighter and fluffier and happy, with these very grounded, real, dare I say, darker themes. It's not like this is a dark book by any means, but it's just very grounded in reality, and not everything is light and fluffy and wonderful. And I like that she used this concept of the second chance romance to explore evolving dynamics in a relationship, and the idea of people finding their way back to each other, rather than always focusing on the early days of a relationship and people getting to know each other for the first time, which is great. I love that, don't get me wrong. But I just really appreciated how she did it here.
There's a level of emotional maturity in that book
There is.
I wouldn't necessarily find in stories of that, like, that nature. They're grown-ups. Like, it's not just doughy-eyed idiocy.
Oh yeah, totally. And the same goes for like the extended friend group in this book as well, where it's very much about you're moving on from the phase where you do everything with your friends and you see them 7 times a week because maybe you live in the same neighborhood and you go into school, you're going to college, and now everybody has their own life, and kind of dealing with that transition, and how do you still keep each other in your lives if you've maybe grown apart or people have moved away. And it's a lot about that as well. So it was just very, very relevant to where I'm at in life, and that's why I ended up putting it over City in Ruins, even though I'm not sure which book I enjoyed more. But just in terms of hitting me in the feels and affecting me personally, Happy Place deserved number 7. And my last one for this first chunk, my 6th favorite book of the year, is a big one that I really struggle to place on this list. And it is one that I thought before I read it might just be number 1. And then I read it and I didn't have that instant, this is my book of the year feeling, and it made me be disappointed with the book. But that's not really fair, because my disappointment stemmed from the fact that I had completely unrealistic expectations for it. This is an incredible book, of my favorite fantasy series, probably. Don't quote me on that, but it might be that I finished this year and it was an absolutely epic conclusion to an epic journey. Of course, I am talking about Assassin's Fate by Robin Hobb. I read this book early in the year, and I don't think it's a perfect book, but I do think it's a perfect ending to the story of the Realm of the Elderlings, even though we might get more, but for now it is the ending. And I just loved my journey with Robin Hobb. Her writing is one that just really, really works for me no matter what she's writing about. Clearly, people say that she's very slow, and I get that, but it just works for me. I can lose myself in her writing, in her characters, in her settings. The reason this book is not higher, I suppose, well, I did say it's not a perfect book, But when I think about Assassin's Fate, I'm thinking about the whole of the realm of the Elderlings. I love this series more than I love this particular book, if that makes sense. I really, really loved it, and it's probably one of my best reading experiences of the year in terms of being so invested in the characters and the story. But that is not the doing of this book specifically. It's the fact that it's a 16th book in a series that I really love. So, my 6th favourite book of the year, Assassin's Fate. My favourite fantasy book of the year. There you go.
If you watch the Tubies, you'll know that we procured some new sponsors for our YouTube channel. And we're going to take a very short break before getting into my 10 through 6 to hear a quick word from our new sponsors. Hello there. Have you ever wanted to start a podcast? Do you want to improve the quality of your YouTube channel? Or do you simply want to have a more commanding, authoritative presence in your daily working life? I can help you build a more professional persona for your hobbies, your podcasting, and in your professional life. I can show you how to have text rolling across the screen to make it look like you really know what you're talking about. I can also show you how to inject some dry, sardonic humor so that people like you. And I can show you how to drop your voice 5 octaves deeper to have those subscribers flocking to your videos. I'm Bridger from the Library Ladder, and welcome to my masterclass.
Thank you so much to Bridger from the Library Ladder and his masterful voice for sponsoring this video. Would you like to kick us off with your 10 to 6?
My number 10 on this list, my 10th favourite book of 2024, is In a Lonely Place by Dorothy B. Hughes, which is 1947 LA Noir. In a Lonely Place is a classic crime noir book of the ilk of Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler, but written from a very uniquely and way ahead of its time feminist perspective, where we follow a wannabe detective / crime novelist by the name of Dick Steele. Very much on the nose, pun intended, name for the protagonist there. He thinks he's the smartest person in all the rooms. He thinks all the women around him are swooning after him, and he happens to not be exactly what he thinks he is. In Ireland, we'd say he thinks he's the dog's bollocks, but he's absolutely not. And this book is quite funny, but it's also very witty, intelligent, and it's very, very atmospheric. It's exactly it. There is still a love that Dorothy B. Hughes shows for the noir genre and the aesthetic and the vibes. This is all vibes. It's foggy when it needs to be foggy, street lights, old cars described in very cool ways. But also, because it's LA Noir, when it's sunny, it's got that sunshine noir vibe of like movies like Get Shorty and that kind of thing. This is just a great little book, and it's kind of it's interesting also because of when it was published, and also what they did with the film adaptation and the ending, and kind of changing the fundamental nature of the story and what the book is really doing, and how it's examining or like exploring the crime noir genre, especially at that time where you had nothing but damsels in distress, you know, private eyes who were the smartest guy in the room at all times. It's a really, really great book, and it's my number 10 of the year. Number 9 on the list for me is James Baldwin with Giovanni's Room, which is a wonderful little book that's about 180 pages, maybe 160, and it is a romantic tragedy novel about an American man who kind of runs away from America, travels to Europe to kind of find himself but also escape himself. And he's pushing everybody away because he's realized that he is gay. And this was written in the 50s, and it's kind of set in the same era as well. And this main character goes off to Paris and meets an Italian bartender by the name of Giovanni, and they fall in love and they have this messy, tumultuous affair while our main protagonist is engaged to be married to an American woman who is currently traveling in Spain. And he goes and stays in Giovanni's room, and we get kind of swirled into this complicated, messy love triangle. And it is handled with a delicacy and complexity that made it feel all too real and realistic, but it is also an unbearably tragic book, and the main protagonist isn't all that likable. But I think James Baldwin really tried to write a protagonist who is gay in that era of intolerance, and what exactly would that do to a person's mentality and approach to other people. And this constant kind of pushing people away or being very guarded and quite self-centered because they just need to protect themselves. They're constantly feeling like they're under attack, even from those that show them love. And this guy kind of closes himself off to everything and everyone. And it makes for an uncomfortable reading experience. I'm sure like modern readers might look back on it and think this character is just a bit of an asshole. But I think James Baldwin kind of doesn't shy away from showing you that even within the LGBT community, there is homophobia and there's transphobia within that kind of intersectionality. Very much exists within those communities. And the main protagonist, while being a gay man himself, displays some very upsetting homophobia, but he doesn't paint him as a horrible person. He's just trying to show kind of an honest psychological portrayal of a character living in these circumstances. And it's a really, really good book. There's a lot of really great writing here about life decisions and becoming who you are. And like you were saying with Happy Place, I just sort of read it at the same time as well. 2024 was a rough year. I lost my job. There was a lot of shit going on. And I read a bunch of books kind of in this area of talking about life decisions and where it is you're going, and are you running towards something or away from something. And James Baldwin had several passages in this book that really hit home in that way. So that's why it's number 9 on my list. He was also one of the authors that I wanted to read this year for my American fiction project. Number 8 on my list is a book that feels like it's way too low. I feel like had I read this book in 2023, it might have been like number 3 or something. And any other year, it could be a book of the year. But that's how stacked this year was for me. Number 8 on the list is Pop 1280 by Jim Thompson, which I think is an outstanding little crime novel that veers more towards the literary fiction side, in my opinion. You could equate it to like something akin to Child of God by McCarthy, but better. That kind of exploration of somebody in the deep south who is a really psychologically messed up sociopath. And it is about a sheriff in a small town in Texas set around 1917 who presents himself as a sort of bumbling, polite buffoon who plays dumb and lets other people think that they're manipulating him or getting one over on him. He is always 2 steps ahead of everybody else, and he's playing everybody else. For me, it kind of, the last chapter or so really elevated it into this might be one of my favorite crime novels of all time, because it becomes a little bit metaphorical towards the end. In my interpretation anyway, I kind of see the main character as this sort of impartial judge, jury, executioner style, maybe a shepherd of a flock. And there's a lot of that kind of language that's used where you're questioning, is this person a a divine figure or something like that. Not necessarily like mystical or anything, but it just gets this air of metaphor that I really, really liked. And it certainly elevated this book, but it's also very quick and easy to read. The writing is really crisp and it's efficient. It's very, very short. It's a very, very short book. Again, another kind of unlikable character, but this book also made me laugh a lot. So yeah, that's number 8 on my list.
Kind of making me regret not putting it on my list. You're reminding me of how great that book was. It was on my like long list, but then it got the cut.
I'm going to be saying this for the next few books, but number 7 on my list feels like it's far too low. Number 7 on my list is A Star Called Henry by Roddy Doyle.
Oh, I thought that would be higher, yeah.
So did I. When we got down to brass tacks, I don't know what I can drop out of the top 5, 6. This is probably my favourite Roddy Doyle book. Roddy Doyle is one of my favourite authors. I feel like he captures the spirit of modern Dublin better than a lot of other writers. Honestly, better than any other writer, really. To me, he is to Dublin what the rest of the literary world thinks Ulysses is to Dublin. And A Star Called Henry, I would go as far to say as it's a great Irish novel if you want something akin to the great American novel for Ireland. It is a historical fiction book about a character by the name of Henry Smart, who was born in the slums of North Dublin in 1899 or 1900, just on the cusp of radical revolution and change in Ireland in the 20th century. The War of Independence, the Civil War, the Dublin lockout of 1913, the trade union strikes, all of this kind of stuff, and this sort of rising up of the impoverished in Ireland under the British Empire at that time. And Henry Smart is this wisecracking little smart arse, another character with a name that is very much on the nose. He sort of Forrest Gumps his way through Irish history, where he meets a lot of the famous players in the Irish War of Independence, and he plays his own little role. But it's a wonderful story. It captures Dublin speak and dialogue and dialect wonderfully well. There'll be another writer on this list as well who does exactly the same thing. It's just a thing that I enjoy reading. I enjoy reading other ways to be artful without having to be super pretentious, because the way we speak in Dublin I don't find to be very pretentious at all.
I'm not in North Dublin.
Not in North Dublin. And I like when authors use that to be artful, because it kind of shows that it's possible. So yeah, Star Called Henry is my number 7. Was that 7?
That was 7.
God. I read a lot of really great books this year. Number 6 on my list, my God, is Hyperion by Dan Simmons. One of the best science fiction novels I've ever read in my life is number 6 on my list for 2024. What can I say? This book ticks all of my multi-genre taste buds. The variety of kind of genres that we like here on the channel are represented in this one science fiction novel. You've got horror, you've got literary fiction, you've got classic hard-boiled crime, you've got science fiction, you've got a bit of fantasy and magic and ethereal wonder going on, and you've got engaging, vivid characters that leap off the page. And I kind of find this with all of the books that are on my list. I do find that I am quite a character-focused reader. If I don't get invested in your character, if it doesn't leap off the page at me, I'm not going to get invested in the book necessarily. It would need to then be bolstered heavily by a really strong plot or really, really strong writing. But I think a lot of the books on this list are quite character-focused. Some may not be character-driven, but certainly character-focused. And that's what Hyperion is. All of these stories are about 7 pilgrims that are traveling to the planet Hyperion to confront a divine figure known as the Shrike for answers. And each one tells their story in the vein of the Canterbury Tales. On the way to the planet, they tell their stories to each other, and we learn about them, we learn why they're there and why they're on the journey that they're on. And it's quite a philosophical book. It's a lot about life and decisions. And again, I've read another little book that had a lot of this kind of stuff in it. and it hit me at the right time. And it's also a book that I've been wanting to read for a really, really long time. It's been on my sci-fi radar for quite a while. I started reading sci-fi pretty young, probably at like the age of 10 or something, 9 or 10, and it's always been high up there. But I don't think I would have appreciated this book as a teenager as much as I did reading it now.
All right, before we get into our 5 to 2s, we were lucky enough to have not just one sponsor, but several, and we'll be back after a quick word from them.
Do you struggle to focus at work? Is it difficult to read 10 pages in a row without doom scrolling? Do you drift off when listening to audiobooks at a perfectly normal speed? Well, let me introduce you to our brand new formula, Kyle Aid. Just one sip of this superhuman attention serum will mean you never have to spend a single moment with your own thoughts ever again. Clinically proven to last for up to 24 hours of undivided, unwavering attention to audiobooks at 3 times the speed. You could read up to 30 books a month without ever having to sleep. Kyle Aid Limited does not accept liability for any of the following side effects: diarrhea, memory loss, missing limbs, missing work meetings, all books blending together, or gout. Huge thanks to our sponsors there. We are arriving at the top 5, ladies and gentlemen. Do you want to get into your 5 through 2?
So far, there's been some Robin Hobb, there's been violence in small towns, the anxiety of turning 30, there's been kidnappings, there's been mob wars. If you thought that was dark, prepare yourself for my top 5 reads of 2024. There might be a theme. My number 5, my 5th favourite book that I read this year, is a very recent book again. I feel like there's a couple of very recent ones and a couple that are very early in the year, and I teased this at the beginning of the video, and it's Penance by Eliza Clark.
The top 5.
This book is about the torture and brutal murder of a 16-year-old girl by 3 of her classmates, and a journalist/writer writes a true crime novel about this gruesome murder. And what we're reading is the true crime novel written by that journalist. It creates like a bit of a meta narrative in that way, and we also have a combination of, I guess, mediums. We have fake podcast transcripts, we have extracts from letters, we have transcriptions from interviews, and it makes for a very dynamic reading experience. But more than anything else, what made this book such an incredible reading experience for me was that it's a true portrait of being a teenage girl in the early 2010s. And the characters in this book are a couple of years younger than me, so there was the odd bit, like for example, references to Instagram or Snapchat that were not around when I was that age, but mostly it just rang very, very true for my lived experience. And I have never in my life read a book that went so deep into the dark side specifically of being a teenage girl. I feel like I have read a lot of coming of age books about boys, and there are parts of that lived experience that are universal and translate, but I don't think it was until I read this book that I realized that I had never read one like it, because it specifically looks at the darkness and the most fucked up bits of that entire experience. So I'm talking about things like the beginnings of social media culture, where it's very normal to have a presence on the internet, but we're talking about teenagers who didn't grow up with that as an obvious thing. So it's all very new and not really policed. The parents don't understand it. So like we have references to Tumblr a lot. We have references to playing The Sims, and this is the kind of thing where like they're talking about The Sims 4 and I'm like, well, for me it was more like The Sims 2 going into The Sims 3, but it's little details like that, or like they talk about Neopets and I was like, oh my god, this is a blast from the past. So it was just, it's one of those hyper specific books in what it is that they're talking about, and that slice of life of a very specific time and point of view and experience. And because it's not trying to be universal, it is capturing something in a very special and unique way. And I think that this is a book that will be looked back on as a portrait of its time.
Absolutely.
In decades in the future.
I read Penance as well this year. Unfortunately, it did not make my top 10, but I totally get why it made yours. But I said the same thing when I read it. I was like, Eliza Clark is writing books that capture a period in time with a level of social criticism that will probably make her books classics in decades to come.
I think so. And she's also just compulsively readable. I find Boy Parts was less dense than Penance. There were bits in Penance that are just a bit slower because of the nature of how it's written and what it's trying to do. So it's not a negative, it's just a little bit different. It's also longer than Boy Parts. But what they both have in common, I think, is that it's obviously showing a dark side to femininity. Here specifically, it's teenage girls, like very young girls, as opposed to Penance being more about young women. They are both, I think, relatable up to a point where it's slightly concerning. Like, it taps into dark parts of somebody's thoughts or subconscious that you might not want to tap into because you're a decent person or because it's a taboo and you don't want to go there. And Eliza Clark taps into that in her books. And I think it's a fascinating reading experience because it kind of confronts you with the darkness in yourself. Also, I don't want to give anything away about either of these books, so I won't go into specifics, but I think in both of her novels, Eliza Clark has themes of women not being believed for different reasons. Specifically, I suppose, women not being believed in terms of being bad because they are young, because they are pretty, because they're conventionally attractive and conform to femininity in the way that society expects them to. And therefore, that same society does not want to believe that they're also capable of horrible things. I think you described it in your like little review of Boy Parts as like dark feminism.
Yeah.
In terms of, women can be fucked up too. And women so can teenage girls.
Women can also be a threat.
Yeah.
Which is, obviously, it's not something to condone, and it's not what Eliza Clark is trying to say, necessarily, that like, oh, hey, watch out, because we'll come... It's not that. It's just... It's this level of dismissing women on all levels.
Yeah.
And just not taking women seriously at all. In this, like, even in these dark moments.
I don't think I've read anybody contemporary or otherwise, but like specifically contemporary, who does it as well as she does. My number 4 is My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell.
This is a dark top 5.
This is I did warn you. This is a dark top 5. This is once again a very recent read. This is the last recent read on this list, and it is the darkest book I've read this year, and probably in several years, I would say. I did put out a little review for it, so I want to be relatively brief here to not extend this video like longer than it has to be. But essentially, this is a book about abuse of a minor, of a young girl, a 15-year-old girl, by her teacher in boarding school. And it's written from her perspective the entire way through. We have like bits where she's a teenager, bits where she's an adult 15 years later looking back on it, and how she gets to a point where she is ready to admit that she has trauma to deal with. That is basically what this is. And it's a book that does not shy away from just how fucked up and dark the subject matter is. It's enraging. It's disgusting, It's also deeply, deeply sad, and it's an exercise as well of stretching your empathy for someone who is not a perfect victim. It's an incredible, incredible book. Our friend Jimmy from the Fantasy Network described it as an important book, and I think that is exactly what this is. That's the perfect one-word description of this book. I am glad that this exists, that it's out there, and that people can read it. I wish I could say it gets more lighthearted from here, but it really does not. My number 3, my third favorite book of the year, we're on the podium, is Will and Testament by Vigdis Hjorth. This is kind of about the same thing, only the main character is older. So here we're dealing with an inheritance dispute. The main character is in her 40s, 50s, something like, I think 50s. She has 3 siblings. Herself and her brother don't speak to their parents anymore. Their 2 sisters do. The father dies, and there's an inheritance dispute. That's basically what kickstarts everything, and then we start unraveling that family dynamic and trauma and the past relationships, and there's a lot of focus actually on memory and just on what trauma will do to a person long term, and how she navigates that. It's translated from Norwegian. It's almost at times written as if it was vignettes, which I think represents how her memory works and it being a bit scattered. I thought that was a very clever way to write this book. And it also makes it very readable because you have these 1 to 3 page chunks to read through, and it just made it very easy for me to keep turning the page, even though it is such a dark book. Once again, I think this is a great book regardless, but I picked this up at the right time and I loved it, and I think Vigdis Hjorth is an incredible author. So that is my number 3. My top 2 are both really, really great books. And the one that I settled on for number 2 was one where I pretty early on knew this is going to be a banger. This author is going to become an all-time favorite author. Sometimes you just know. Sometimes you read a couple of pages and things are clicking into place and you just know. It's not just this one book. It's how this person writes. So I find it sometimes difficult to judge just this book as opposed to judging the fact that it's introduced me to an author that I will be reading everything by pretty soon. And there's a good bit to get to, and I'm extremely excited. And it also happened in the same year where Don Winslow came out with his last book. So I'm in need of a new favorite author to sink my teeth into. You might have guessed what I'm talking about. It is Mystic River by Dennis Lehane. This book is a perfect literary crime book. Dennis Lehane knows how to write. He knows how to build characters. He knows how to build drama and tragedy. This is a very sad book. There's a theme where basically we have 3 children at the beginning and in the prologue, I believe, and one of them gets abducted for a couple of days and then eventually returns. We fast forward, they're all adults. One of them is now a cop, and one of their daughters disappears. We go from there and we start pulling on threads of the past, and it's a wonderful character study as well as the actual mystery, and just one of those books where you're reading and you know this is not going to end well. You know bad things are going to happen, and there's nothing you or anybody in the book can do to stop it, and you can kind of empathize with everybody for different reasons, and you just want it to be okay, but you know that there's a very, very low chance that it can be. And it's a wonderful book. I loved it so, so, so much. I read another one by Dennis Lehane afterwards, Small Mercies, and I'm actually in the middle of another one right now. I'm so happy that I finally read this author and that it worked so well for me.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So, Mystic River by Dennis Lehane, my second favorite book of 2024.
My number 5 I wanted to have a book by this author in the top 10, and then it just came down to choosing between the two. But I actually think that potentially the other book that I would have put in the top 10 by this author might have been lower, which would have pushed everything up. But I think this one, I've settled on it, which means this is the one. It's The Trespasser by Tana French. That's my number 5. And let me tell you why. Tana French is one of my favorite Irish authors. One of my favorite contemporary Irish fiction writers. She is ostensibly a crime fiction author, but she is just a great author. Her crime mysteries aren't necessarily the attractions of her books. I couldn't really tell you anything about the mysteries that I've read in the books that I've read by her, but I could tell you about the characters, about the people populating the pages, and about the locations, and how the characters speak. Like I said with Roddy Doyle, Tana French captures a way of speaking in The Trespasser that is very, very inner city Dublin. There's a lot of sort of biting sarcasm and ironic humor. It's a little bit edgy, but not edgy in a, like, I compared it to like movies set in Boston or like the Bronx or something, compared to something set in Texas or Louisiana, Mississippi. Those sort of, it's a little more chill there in terms of the way people talk to each other than it would be maybe in one of those big urban areas in the East Coast. Similar vibe in Ireland. Tana French displays a range that I don't think Roddy Doyle necessarily has. Roddy Doyle is great at being artful with character and dialogue and how they speak. Tana French has a real range in her styles of writing as well, and she mimics her pacing, her paragraph structure, the flow of her prose with the location in which she sets her stories. The Trespasser is set in inner city Dublin, and this book I chose over The Searcher, which I also read in 2024, early 2024, because it's just very me. And actually the crime takes place pretty much where we live, which is just, it's home, so I'm more connected to it, but also how she describes places. There's characters that go and sit in a park, and how she describes it is how a person from Dublin would describe the park. It's very funny, sarcastic, self-deprecating, a lot of foul language. The sort of descriptors are very funny. And The Searcher is obviously set on the west coast of Ireland. Things are a little slower. People talk differently. There's a vastly different dialect and accent. And the pacing of that book matches that. And I find that really interesting in the way she writes. It's only something I really discovered about her this year because I read The Searcher. And then I came back to the Dublin murder books, basically. But this one also has a very interesting plot. And I think it's the first time that I've really been invested in one of the plots. It's still not something that I really care about. Like, I don't read her for her crime fiction. I read her for how she describes my home to me. And that's why she's on the top 10. And that's why she's in the top 5. And it's why she's one of my favorite contemporary authors working today. The Dublin Murder Squad books are 6 books that follow a different set of detectives in each book. And you can kind of read them in any order you want. Some detectives from other books make little cameo appearances because it's one unit, basically. But each one follows one main character and their partner. And the main character in The Trespasser was actually the partner of the main character from the previous book. She has a great balance as well of plot-driven versus character-driven. I would say she leans towards character-driven storytelling, but I think she's sort of perfecting the plot here in The Trespasser because it is probably the most interesting I've read. She's an outstanding writer, and she's at my number 5. My number 4 is The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, which I fully expected when I read it to certainly be in the top 3, but we'll get to that in a moment. I think my favourite John Steinbeck so far. A huge element of this is John Steinbeck's subject matter just speaks to me. Sometimes you like reading authors that really challenge your worldview or make you think about things in a new light and sort of challenge you in that way. John Steinbeck just puts into words things that I believe in and I sort of struggle with in daily life, in professional life. I read this book when I was going through negotiations with my previous job when I was getting laid off, thinking about all the work that I'd done and this sort of casual dismissiveness and the sort of coldness of it all, and not really seeing the point in it either. Like it's pointless. Going through the process, I was telling my dad about it, and he's like, you're looking for logic where no logic exists. And I just find this incredibly frustrating, because you're just like, well, why? Like, it doesn't make any sense. And John Steinbeck puts into words all of these things through his character stories. Mm-hmm. The Grapes of Wrath is basically about the mass migration from sort of Oklahoma, the Dust Bowl, over to California in the Great Depression, looking for work. And how a lot of people were really exploited, and how land was just taken from people and kind of destroyed for profit, and how people just get wrapped up in the system and they start looking out for themselves because things are difficult. So as long as I have my back, I don't need to worry about anybody else. This selfishness that creates it, that is created, and this sort of inherent nasty competitiveness, which I just sort of fundamentally disagree that competitiveness or competition is the only driving factor in human progress. I think a little bit of competition is fine, but like, what happened to collaboration and cooperation and people being kind to each other and people not stepping on another person for progress and people not taking things so fucking seriously all the time? Why don't we have a bit of a laugh? And John Steinbeck, I think, reaffirms my own beliefs a little bit. He doesn't necessarily challenge my beliefs in any way, but he puts them into words in a way that I vibe with. It works for me. And I think he's the best one at tapping into those little bits of my own ideology and putting it into words in ways that I couldn't. So that is why The Grapes of Wrath is at number 4 for me. But the reason it's not in the top 3 is because Emma Newman is number 3. If you've been following the channel for the last couple of weeks or months, you'll know that the Planetfall series by Emma Newman is possibly my favourite science fiction series. And Before Mars, book 3 in the Planetfall books, is my favourite because it takes all of the elements of the other 3 Planetfall books and puts it in one. She writes heavily character-driven science fiction with a strong focus on mental health and mental illness. And there's also, similar to John Steinbeck, a huge focus on subjugation, oppression, modern slavery that is sort of nuanced, but she takes it to, obviously it's science fiction, she takes it into the future and kind of looks at this sort of indentured servitude to big corporations and all this kind of thing. And that's a cornerstone of her books. And she shows this sort of anger at detachment that people in power get from those who are subjugated or those who are oppressed. And that's what her books are really about. But at the center of it, you have very, very focused character stories, very singular character studies, where you follow a main character in each book, and each book is kind of loosely connected. Before Mars is about a geologist slash painter who is sent up to a base on Mars to paint pictures of Mars so that her corporate boss can sell them for a lot of money, and he wants her to go up and use authentic Mars dirt. And there's bigger stuff going on in the third book that I can't really say because you should probably read the second one before, because there's contextual stuff there, so I won't really mention. But the main character in this one also suffers from postpartum depression, and maybe her family has a history of schizophrenia, paranoia, that kind of not trusting their own mind. And there's a huge subplot in this book that is focused very heavily on that. What is real? Who is lying to me? Who is telling the truth? What does the truth actually mean? I just find all of her sort of themes in her books are very topical for now. The sci-fi elements as the series progresses get really, really interesting in terms of thinking about where we might be or where we already are. She does it by writing real page turners. Like, these are thrillers, but they're also quite literary. So it's just blending a lot of what I like: science fiction, literary fiction, and thrillers. Very character driven, and I was hooked by this book. It also came at a time where I was sort of struggling to get through things or really enjoy things for about a month or two, and I was glued to this one. So Before Mars is my number 3. My number 2 of 2024 is a fantasy book, and it's the only fantasy book on my list. If you've followed StoryToob in 2024, I think it's clear what that might be. And if you watched the Tubies the other day, it will also be clear what this book is. This is book 3 in the Malazan Book of the Fallen by Stephen Erickson. Memories of Ice is my second favorite read of 2024. And if you want all my thoughts on this book, go watch the 52-minute review that I did. If you don't want any spoilers, there's about 11-12 minutes in that video that is fully non-spoiler, where I give you all my thoughts. But my God, I can't even explain what this book is to people if you've not read the Malazan books. It's fantasy, it's big, it's epic, it's got wonderful characters, it's got stories that make me laugh, make you cry, rip your heart out, make you fist bump. Everything that a big epic fantasy adventure should be, with all of the depth of some of the best literature that I've read, where you can really sink your teeth into metaphor and theme and character and what is being said, and poetic mirroring that goes on with character stories and what's being explored here, and how is he questioning, commenting on fantasy as a genre, literature as a thing, culture, art, history, anthropology, all that big shit is in there as well. But also there's a floating city in the sky and massive dragons, and there's a guy that eats a lot of cake and is really nice to everyone and makes jokes. Krupp is the best character of the year. It's just a bananas book. It's a bananas series. One of my favorite things in anything, in people, in movies, in books, is something that doesn't take itself serious while still being worthy of being taken seriously. And I think that Malazan is that. And I think that's why I connect to it so much. I'm also one that is very, very happy to be taken along for the ride, and I'm like, whoa, this is all new to me. And I never know what's going to happen in a Malazan book. They are all over the shop, which might frustrate a lot of readers, but it works for me. So Memories of Ice is my number 2. Before we reveal our top books of the year, both our number 1s, we have another little quick word from another one of our sponsors.
Sometimes books are worth 5 stars on Goodreads. Sometimes they're even worth a nut button. But some books are just bullshit. Introducing the new Bullshit Button, your new way to convey your nuanced feelings about bullshit books.
Bullshit.
I used to just DNF everything and then fade into oblivion. But now, I feel seen and heard. Reading is bullshit.
Bullshit. Bullshit in oil too.
Gone are the days of rant videos on booktube or reading angry, nonsensical Goodreads reviews. The Bullshit Button dispenses with all of that bullshit.
Bullshit alert.
I love the bullshit button. I even use it in work. It's great for bullshit meetings.
Buy your Bullshit Button for only $69.99 today. Well, we're about to reveal 2 books that were certainly not bullshit. before we go ahead and let you know what our favorite books of 2024 were, let us know in the comments what you think. Have you guessed it? Have the other 9 given it away? Is there anything missing that absolutely should be on the list? You might be able to figure it out. My favorite book of 2024. This one's actually kind of surprising. I think if you had told me at the beginning of the year, this is what your favorite read of 2024 is going to be, I would have been like, that's so random. What even is that? I had not heard of this book until like 2 weeks before I read it, I think. But once it came to making the top 10, it was kind of a no-brainer. This is hands down one of the best books I have ever read in terms of structure and how it's put together, what it's saying, subtext, prose, character, everything. And it is, and I know this is going to make one viewer very happy, Ohio by Stephen Markley. Shout out to our friend Kev from the channel Kevin Jenkins for reading and talking about this book and recommending it. I read it back in February, March for the month of Kevrary. And it has held up until the end of the year, and it is the best thing I've read this year. So
I can hear a can of Monster being thrown into the air effusively.
So this book takes place in one night, and we have 4 perspectives of 4 people that are, I think, in their like early 30s, I'm not entirely sure, who all went to high school together. And we see how this one night develops for each of them as they come back to their small hometown in Ohio. That is the basic gist of it. It is a dark, sad book, and I think its biggest strength, and I said this back in my review that I put out, which is a double review with Mystic River, funnily enough, that this...
Go check it out, it's a very good video.
Go check it out. It's The American Nightmare. This book succeeds at being absolutely universal, I believe, in theme and in experience by being extremely specific with what experience it's describing. It is extremely specific to early 2000s small town USA. I am not from Ohio, I am not from the US, and I am not from the American continent. And yet the feeling in this book was something that I could relate to and latch on to very, very deeply. There's a lot going on here, too much for me to get into in this one video. Go watch the review. But basically it is doing 2 things, I believe. On the one hand, it is a portrait, a snapshot through this one night and these 4 people and everybody around them of the specific situation of the US and growing up in the US at that time, everything that was going on politically, economically, socially around them. And then it's also a dark, nostalgic look at high school and aging and expectations that you maybe had for yourself and what happened to those hopes and dreams and dealing with them not really being everything that you thought they would be or they might be. In this way, kind of similar thematically to Happy Place, which is a comparison I did not think I would ever make, but in a much darker, some would say, grounded and realistic way. I don't think one is more realistic than the other. I think both experiences can be true or are true for people, but both of these books essentially deal with being an adult and looking back on being a teenager and thinking, where did the time go? And what am I actually doing? Only the experiences of the characters in the 2 books are quite different from each other, and their opportunities that they have based on their background are very different from each other. But the core feeling is the same, which makes sense in terms of why it connected with me when it did. But I'm also just a sucker for some tragedy and for some sadness, especially when it's well-written, character-driven sadness that feels like a self-fulfilling prophecy of people just making all of the wrong choices and understanding why these people are making the wrong choices, because in the situation that they're in, it might feel like the only choice, and that then being a cascading domino effect of wrong choice after wrong choice after wrong choice, ending in tragedy. And I love this book so much. There's so much to it. It is almost like 4 novels in one, and they all connect in a very, very clever way. I thought there's some mystery to it and reveals that I did not necessarily see coming, or I didn't know how it was going to happen. And I just enjoyed my time with it. It was a book where I was reading it and I was happy that there was so much more book to go. I loved it so much. I didn't think I didn't think I was going to love it. I just didn't have any kind of expectations for it. I just kind of wanted to read it because our friend Kev loved it, and we wanted to do a little homage to him and his channel, and it just ended up being one of the best books I've ever read. So thanks, Kev. Go read Ohio. You don't have to be from Ohio.
My number 1 book of the year is not a surprise at all to anybody in the world, because clearly we have a worldwide channel, far-reaching channel.
Oh yeah.
Many subscribers. My number 1 book of the year will come as no surprise if you've been following us at all this year. I said it wouldn't change when I read this book. It didn't change. This is one of the best books I've ever read, probably one of the best crime novels, certainly. That is The Power of the Dog by Don Winslow. It's still the best book I've read this year. I was also so glad because my first reading experience with Don Winslow was a little mixed, and The Power of the Dog is anything but. We also have a review video for this book. We also have a discussion with a bunch of our lovely booktube friends, Joseph, Amanda, RJ and Dan. If you want to go and check that out, we discuss whether we think maybe this book might be the great American novel, or a great American novel, which I firmly believe it is. This book is about the war on drugs, and you look at it from every strata of society and every kind of person that orchestrates it, is involved in it, benefits from it, or very much does not benefit from it at every level. And it's a wonderfully researched polemic in a way. It's kind of an eye-opening experience, this book. And it's very much a deep dive into it. But it is also one of the most page-turning, rip-roaring, fucking steam-rolling books I've ever read in my life. You will absolutely tear through it. It's very easy to read. It leaps off the page at you. And the characters are phenomenal. Very complex characters. Very interesting to follow. Nora is queen. I actually think that the main villain is probably a better person at his core than the protagonist that you follow. There's this sort of collision course storyline between 2 main characters, a protagonist and an antagonist, and Don Winslow presents them both honestly, and those lines begin to blur between protagonist and antagonist. And I actually think at his core, taking out the situations and the circumstances and the actions that both of them take, at his core, the antagonist, like on paper, is possibly the better person, which is a wild thing to think about when you know the atrocities that this person commits. But it's very interesting that he gives you this protagonist that is supposed to be the good guy, and I actually think he's a worse person on the inside than the person who is committing all these atrocities. And that's very interesting as well. So there's also a character level to this book, aside from the grand look at the political institutions and governments and countries and churches and cartels that are involved. And this, I think, is Don Winslow's magnum opus.
Oh yeah.
I won't say too much more about it. You can go watch our review videos. I don't think this is super surprising for anybody who has been following our channel this year, but Power of the Dog by Don Winslow is my number 1. We're gonna wrap this up now because I'm sure this is long. These videos are a ton of fun to make. They are one of my favorite things that we do with our lives now, which is great.
Yeah.
The top 10, the year-end videos, this whole time of year on BookTube is super exciting, and it's great to see so many people being so enthusiastic about all the stuff that they're reading. And I just want to thank everybody who's watching our videos this year. Like you said, it's our first full calendar year. We're almost 2 years on BookTube now, a couple of months away, but our first full calendar year. Thanks to everybody who watches, who comments, who interacts, who just watches and lurks, who shares videos, who got involved with shit that we did this year. Everybody who contributed to the tubies, our fellow booktubers, friends we made along the way. A huge thank you to everybody, because honestly, this channel sort of kept me going this year. 2024 was a bit of a bastard. It was very tough. Job losses, family shit. It was real rough for a while, and this channel is a huge part of what keeps us going. So thanks to everybody.
What he said.
Cool.
Do let us know in the comments what your top 10 of the year is, or your top 5, or your top 13, whatever you want.
Or your
whatever.
top 16.
That's too many. Whatever number you think is appropriate. Definitely let us know if you share any of our top books of the year.
Like, subscribe. We'll see you later. We're ending this video now. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Bye. You've heard of Kyle Aid? Well, let me introduce you to Kyle Aid Max. Minimum sugar, maximum speed. Ever since I started drinking Kyle Aid, I finish buddy reads before they even start. It's been so long since I got dusted in a read-along.
Kyle Aid Limited does not accept liability for any of the following side effects: diarrhea, memory loss, missing limbs, missing work meetings, all books blending together, or gout.